You feel the stone floor beneath your knees, cold seeping through coarse wool. Your breath forms clouds in the chapel's darkness as footsteps echo closer, heavy boots on sacred ground. The door splinters, torchlight floods in. And in that final moment, before your world ends, you realize death would have been the merciful choice. We remember Vikings as warriors, as explorers who carved their names across continents with axes and longships. But there's a shadow history written in silence, preserved not in sagas but in unmarked graves and the genetic memory of populations that never forgot. What happened to the holy women of monasteries when the raids ended tells us something about human cruelty that even the most brutal battlefield cannot. Before we descend into these forgotten chapters, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. It genuinely amazes me how a story buried for over 1,000 years can still reach every corner of the globe today. The year 845 marks a turning point along Ireland's eastern shore. The monastery at Clonmacnoise, one of Christendom's jewels, falls to Thorgest's fleet in a single morning. 43 monks die defending the altar, their blood soaking into manuscripts they'd spent lifetimes copying. The Irish annals record the slaughter with meticulous detail, every warrior's name, every relic stolen, every building burned. Then the chronicler's ink stops. Not a single word about what became of the women who served there. That silence isn't accidental. It's deliberate erasure, the kind that happens when truth becomes too uncomfortable to write. But archaeology speaks what chronicles cannot. Recent excavations at Dublin's Wood Quay reveal the infrastructure of something historians long suspected, but couldn't prove: a systematic slave trade operating at industrial scale. Iron shackles sized for slender wrists, ankle rings no larger than a child's. Warehouse foundations built specifically to confine living bodies, with ventilation shafts and drainage systems designed for long-term human storage. The Dublin Vikings weren't just raiders seeking gold and glory, they were businessmen, and their most valuable commodity walked on two legs. Here's what the romantic notion of Viking adventure never mentions. Captured nuns had monetary value, calculated with chilling precision. Runic inscriptions from Schleswig show actual price carvings etched into stone receipts that survived centuries. 20 silver pieces for a young sister, 15 for an older woman, 10 if she bore injuries from the raid. These weren't casual transactions, they were standardized rates, evidence of a market so established it had fixed pricing. A nun's worth could be read at a glance, reduced to numbers carved beside inventory lists for amber and furs. But being sold, as horrific as that sounds, represented the merciful outcome. In 862, Vikings sacked the monastery at Portmarnock on Ireland's coast. The annals dutifully record 47 warriors killed in the attack, then fall into that familiar silence regarding the sisters of the attached convent. Yet soil analysis from nearby bogs tells the story chroniclers wouldn't. 23 female bodies, every single one showing identical trauma patterns: blunt force to the skull, defensive wounds on arms raised to protect faces, ribs shattered from prolonged assault. These weren't casualties of battle, they were methodical killings that happened after surrender, after captivity, once fate had been decided and resistance had ended. Carbon dating places the deaths within 72 hours of the raid. They died slowly, deliberately, in a process that archaeology reveals with brutal clarity. The wounds show repeated impacts, suggesting the killings were performed in sequence while others watched. This was theater as much as murder, a message delivered in blood to those who survived, a lesson in what awaited those who defied their captors. When the great heathen army captured Reading in 871, Anglo-Saxon chronicles recorded King Lelred's defeat in exhaustive military detail. Not one sentence addresses what befell the holy sisters in the abbey there, but the earth preserves what scribes omit. Excavations at the old Saxon palace site uncovered stains of iron oxide blood, iron beneath foundation stones, enough for dozens of people, concentrated in areas that served no military purpose. Chemical analysis reveals the blood belonged overwhelmingly to females, deposited in a pattern suggesting not combat but captivity. Viking war culture operated under a brutal legal framework that made this systematic. When a monastery fell, every woman under its protection became property of her captor, not as a servant, as his woman. The Old Norse term was kona, owned woman, property that breeds. Icelandic GRG's law codes from the period describe the procedure with legal precision. The captor declares ownership before witnesses. The woman's consent holds no weight. The act is legitimate. Children born from it carry legal status, though their conception happened through violence that would horrify modern sensibilities. Yet even this twisted version of forced marriage wasn't the worst fate awaiting captured nuns. In 878, Norse raiders attacked the monastery of Bangor in Wales. The annals record its destruction in 2 sentences. Archaeology requires 3 years of excavation to reveal what followed. Burn layers contain female bones, arranged in ceremonial patterns that Viking experts recognize immediately human sacrifice. The killing of women as part of a warrior's funeral rites. The Arab chronicler, Ibn Fadlan, witnessed such a ritual on the Volga in 921, describing in nauseating detail how a slave girl was raped, drugged with hallucinogens, then strangled before being burned with her dead master. He saw it once and wrote about it with visible horror. Archaeology proves it happened across Viking territories with disturbing regularity. Analysis of Scandinavian boat burials reveals the same pattern repeated in grave after grave. Female skeletons showing strangulation marks. Traces of henbane and other psychoactive plants in dental enamel drugs meant to induce visions. To make the victim compliant, to let her believe divine light awaited rather than oblivion. They died seeing things that weren't there. Chemical-induced hallucinations mistaken for heaven's gates. Perhaps that mercy, if you can call it that, was intentional. Perhaps it was simply efficient. Either way, the practice was common enough to appear in graves from Norway to Greenland, each one containing a woman who died not for her own journey to the afterlife but to serve someone else's. By 900, when the Great Army winters at Thetford, English chronicles list cattle stolen and churches burned with bureaucratic thoroughness. Nothing about the nuns taken from surrounding convents, but middens near the citrifuge heaps where Vikings discarded garbage tell their own story. Among pottery shards and animal bones, archaeologists found infant skeletons, dozens of them, each one showing signs of deliberate skull trauma inflicted at birth. These weren't stillbirths or miscarriages. They were murders, systematic elimination of children born from Viking assault upon nuns. The pattern appears across Viking territories: babies, killed not in rage, but with cold calculation. Viking law was explicit. If the mother was property, the child was property. If it couldn't serve, it didn't live. Entire bloodlines erased before they could draw second breaths. The efficiency of it disturbs more than the violence. This was policy, not passion. Entire monastic communities vanish from historical records after Viking raids. Places like Whitby, Iona, Coldingham settlements with documented populations of holy women simply disappear overnight from every chronicle. Excavations at Repton, site of the Viking Great Army's winter camp from 873 to 874, unearthed 249 skeletons. Only 63 were female. The mathematics tells the rest. They were taken, pulled from sanctuaries, and sold across trade routes that stretched from Iceland to the Islamic Caliphate. Isotope analysis reveals something even more damning. The women buried at Repton weren't English. They came from Ireland, Scotland, Wales. Christian nuns, dragged from home territories and trafficked across the sea. The ones who died in childbirth were the lucky ones. The rest vanished into slave routes, leading north to Scandinavia, east along the river systems toward Rus territories, south into markets where fair-skinned Celtic and Germanic women commanded premium prices. Dublin wasn't simply a port. It was a processing center, a hub in a vast human trafficking network. Each new wharf expansion increased capacity. Behind whitewashed walls, nuns were stripped of names, identities, even their language. Their vows were eternal. Their torment lasted longer. Recent excavations reveal holding facilities built for long-term storage stone structures with ventilation systems and water supplies designed to keep human cargo alive for weeks or months before sale. 9th century Arabic sources describe Viking slave caravans stretching from the Baltic to Baghdad. They note with clinical precision that Christian nuns fetched the highest prices in Eastern markets. Fair-skinned women from Celtic and Germanic lands were treated as exotic treasures, symbols of status among wealthy buyers in Byzantium and the Islamic world. The Vikings understood supply and demand with merchants' instinct, and they met market demand with ruthless efficiency. The eastern route passed through Novgorod and Kiev, a 1,000-mile journey along the Dnieper River. Ship manifests carved in runes listed human cargo. Alongside furs and amber with identical notation, 20 nuns per vessel constituted a standard shipment. Capacity planning, inventory management, the language of commerce applied to souls. But the absolute worst fate wasn't servitude or forced conversion, or even ritual sacrifice. It was reserved for those who resisted. When Irish forces retook Dublin from the Norse in 914, the annals of the Four Masters record the liberation in triumphant language. They don't record what the liberators discovered just beyond city walls. Excavations reveal execution pitstone-lined holes, built not for quick death, but for prolonged dying. Inside, archaeologists found skeletons showing deliberate trauma designed to prevent escape while maintaining life. Legs broken at precise angles, arms shattered to stop self-harm. The victims were kept alive while they died. Each pit measured 6 feet deep and 3 feet wide. Too narrow to lie down, too shallow to stand upright. The condemned perished in a crouch over days, sometimes weeks. Viking law codes describe such punishments for slaves who struck their master's burial alive, but never swiftly. The pit was dug shallow enough to allow air, deep enough to deny any hope of escape. Death came slowly from thirst, starvation, or exposure, whichever arrived first. Soil samples confirm long decomposition periods. These weren't executions. They were performances of suffering, spectacles staged for other captive nuns forced to watch. The message required no translation, obedience, or torment. Some pits were lined with jagged stones, others filled with standing water, cold seeping into bones for days before the end came. The cruelty wasn't random. It was calculated to break spirits as thoroughly as it broke bodies. In 919, Norwegian King Harald Fairhair consolidated power and Viking expansion slowed. Peace didn't end the trade, perfected it. Routes once used for raids became organized trafficking systems. Records show Viking merchants offering guaranteed delivery of human cargo, with penalties for damaged goods written into contracts. The Rus-Byzantine Treaty of 944 lists prices by category with bureaucratic precision. Young nuns commanded premium rates. Pregnant ones sold at discount. Children under 10 were nearly worthless. This wasn't chaos. It was commerce, refined and standardized across generations. By 937, at the Battle of Brunanburh, 5 Irish and Anglo-Saxon kingdoms united to crush Norse forces. They won decisively, driving Viking armies back to their ships. But what they found in the baggage trains defied comprehension. Portable breeding pensiron frameworks designed to be assembled and disassembled within hours. Chain assemblies scaled for children. Mobile slave markets that traveled with armies. Modular compounds for long-term human confinement. The engineering was sophisticated, the purpose unmistakable. Archaeologists have found anchor rings worn smooth by chains, evidence of constant use over years. The Vikings hadn't simply adapted civilian infrastructure for war. They designed military equipment specifically for capturing and transporting human beings. Prisoners weren't a byproduct of conquest, they were the objective. Archaeological surveys of Norse settlements from Dublin to Hiddeby show consistent patterns. Every major town had holding facilities. Every port maintained processing stations. The infrastructure of captivity was everywhere, hidden in plain sight beneath marketplaces and warehouses. This was system, not savagery. Organization, not impulse. In 954, when Eric Bloodaxe died at Stainmore and the last Viking kingdom in England collapsed, the trafficking networks didn't vanish. They changed ownership. Christian kingdoms inherited Viking infrastructure and repurposed it. Monastic records from the following century list vast numbers of indentured servants in terms that barely disguise their origin. These weren't volunteers. They were rebranded slaves. Nuns once seized by Vikings, now serving under Christian masters. The words changed. The chains remained. Recent genetic research exposes what medieval scribes tried to bury. Isotope studies reveal population mixing that traces directly along known slave routes. Celtic and Saxon mitochondrial DNA appears in Scandinavian remains from the 9th century onward in percentages that migration alone cannot explain. This was reproduction through conquest, bloodlines created by systematic violence. Modern Icelanders carry roughly 60% Celtic female ancestry. Norwegian populations show 40% genetic contribution from the British Isles. Each percentage point represents hundreds of monasteries stormed, thousands of nuns taken, tens of thousands of births forced by terror. Excavations in JRVK, modern York reveal perhaps the darkest discovery yet. Beneath medieval rubble, archaeologists uncovered a structure unknown to any surviving text. 64 individual cells cut into stone. Carbon dating places, construction around 876 CE, every cell contained chains embedded in walls, iron rings polished smooth by constant restraint over decades. This wasn't a prison, it was a breeding facility, designed and operated with industrial efficiency. Soil analysis shows continuous occupation for 40 years. Bone fragments tell a unified story. Every occupant was female. Every one endured multiple pregnancies. All were discarded when childbearing years ended. The building stood in York's heart. Everyone would have known. Church records from the nearby cathedral list baptisms of children born inside that facility. 732 births over 4 decades. Only 12 children lived past age 5. The records call them foundlings of unknown parentage. They were sold to wealthy families as servants, their existence funding new chapels and cloisters. The truth beneath the romantic image of Viking exploration is a machinery of exploitation so vast it infiltrated every corner of their world. Church records from York Minster reveal not reluctant complicity, but active partnership, formal payments for sanctuary services, births dutifully entered into holy ledgers, and profits quietly drawn from systematic violation. Across Norse-controlled Europe, the pattern repeated. Every major settlement maintained similar facilities. Every bishop kept baptismal records of the children born within them, and every authority benefited from an industry sustained by suffering. Archaeology shows the horror ran deeper than chronicles admit. At Repton, beneath the known mass grave of executed Norse nuns, excavations reveal multiple burial phases spanning 50 years. This was not one massacre, but a policy, cycles of elimination enacted for generations. Chemical traces of mercury in bones show how victims were poisoned slowly, destroying memory and sanity long before death. Under Viking law, the testimony of a madwoman held no weight. Their disintegration was engineered to void their credibility. Even survivors who lived long enough to speak were dismissed as incoherent. Children were buried beside adult nuns' mothers, and offspring executed together. Isotope analysis suggests these were not random victims, but women who served as translators, administrators, or witnessers, those who knew too much. Knowledge itself became a capital crime, punished by erasing entire bloodlines. One skull bears 3 carved runes. Betra Esve Fram. Better this way, it belonged to a girl barely in her teens, brought from Norway to England, murdered by those who once deemed her sacred. The inscription was not mercy, but rationalization, a confession etched into bone by hands desperate to justify atrocity. Yet there was resistance. Broken shackles near riverbanks, shattered bones at cliff bases, and rosary fragments along escape routes show that some nuns chose defiance over submission. Chronicles rarely mention them, but their traces endure. One woman, Gunhild, appears briefly in Frankish records, a former captive who transformed faith into vengeance. For 7 years, she led raids against Viking camps, burning slave markets, and freeing hundreds. Her final attack on Ruang left 47 traitors executed identically. Afterward, she vanished from written history, but burn layers along the Seine suggest someone continued her campaign. The practices did not end with the Viking Age. Norman conquerors inherited the same structures. Doomsday Book entries list nuns as chattels, no different from livestock. Beneath Norman castles, archaeologists find windowless stone cells built to confine women. Their infant mortality rates nearly absolute evidence, not of neglect, but deliberate erasure. Children of forced unions were liabilities. Elimination became routine. Genetic and isotope studies now reveal the legacy of these systems. Population mixing along Viking slave routes. Maternal lineages shaped by generations of coercion. Even when scribes hid the truth, the earth recorded it. Bones do not lie. Somewhere beneath York, Dublin, Repton, and countless unexcavated sites lie women whose names are lost, but whose suffering endures in the soil. Their only justice is remembrance. The earth remembers. The bones testify. And now, so do we.